our beach board, and it's not public anywhere else. And I'm not posting it on YouTube or anything else. So you would have to have access to beach board, or you have to get somebody to watch it off of your beach board, which would be a really terrible thing for you all to do. So I'm recording it, just so you know. Feel free to mute, unmute, put on your camera. Don't put your camera. A couple of things. I want to clarify one thing, just in case folks have missed it. So all of the different, there is two kind of deadline. There's 3 deadlines every Sunday night. One is for your reading response for the week. 2 is for the lecture response for that week. And 3, in case you have, if you want to pose questions, if you have discussion, if you have comments, to post them so I could, so that we could make sure to respond to those. Those are all due on Sunday nights. However, what I've said is after week 8, all things after that point, I am not counting anything late, or I'm not taking points off for being late, which effectively means that you could turn everything in late, right? It effectively means that there's that you could turn them in at the end. But I just kind of want to make that clear to folks in case, because I did get a couple of questions of people had all kinds of different things that came up because of the situation that we're in and couldn't turn things in and wanted extensions. You don't need to ask me for an extension. You could just turn it in late. So I did grade things, but I'll go back and grade them after you turn them in. So just kind of putting that out there. The second is, look, I need to apologize to you all because I have not graded your papers. This is I'm usually not this bad, but I got the papers right when the world changed. And this has been, there's been some casualties of things that I've had to do, but really it's been the 317 papers. So I am profoundly sorry for that. I will get to it, and I just wanted to let you know that that I'm not letting it slide. So I wanted to put that out there. So we'll come back. We'll start by talking about the videos and all of that. But before that, I wanted to. One of your classmates has been Nathan has been working on a campaign, and he asked me to share an email with you all that I'll send out, but since he's here, he could maybe talk about, introduce it, so that way I don't need to speak for him. So go ahead, Nathan.
For sure. What's up, y'all? Yeah, so the student org I'm a part of, Students for Quality Education. We're like a statewide organization at every CSU. And like we try to organize around student efforts and like what that means, right? Of course, with like all this stuff going on. We're trying to measure like what students are going through, right? And we don't trust like the surveys that are being passed out by like the chancellor or like the president. So we made our own survey to really measure like what students are going through, and it covers like a wide range of topics. It takes like 5 minutes, but it's like housing, if you had student housing before, or if you had like a campus job or something, and just like pedagogy, like how you like adapting, or like what are like things that are coming up in your classrooms. Yeah, and then the professor will email that survey out. Yeah, that's about it. And we should be like talking about the answers like in 2 weeks, like at around the end of this month, if y'all want to come to like our open forum, if y'all, yeah. But for sure, any questions?
Is that over?
Yeah, it should be over. Yeah. But we're still like figuring out like everything. But I can like let y'all know next week if we have like more details fleshed out.
I'll be here.
For sure.
Does your club have like social media or anything that we can follow?
Yeah, I can put it in the chat, but it's SQE Long Beach for everything. Yeah, so like Instagram, Twitter,
Thanks.
Facebook. Anything else?
Thank you, Nathan. Any other questions for Nathan? All right, very cool. So I have posted a couple of more videos for this week, and so what I want to spend the time talking about is kind of questions. First, I want to address if there's any kind of pointed questions or things that you were reading that just didn't make any sense to you, or things I said in the video that just kind of went over your head or you just didn't understand. I'd be more than happy to kind of deal with those questions first. But then out of that, we could kind of open it up again and kind of pick up thoughts as they emerge. I'm sharing with you the screen of at least my notes that I took from the questions that people asked last week. Last week, our conversation was just kind of more open about, as a result of the current pandemic, what were things that, what were questions that people were having, or what were thoughts that people were kind of thinking through and dealing with, at least in their own heads. So I want to put this out there in case that kind of generates any questions or comments for you all. But I want to kind of start off with if there's any questions about the videos, and then also like formatting wise. I know the videos are quite long. That is because this class isn't an online class, so I didn't think about initially how to make them short. You know, they like, people say 15-minute videos, so I'm basically saying what I would say in class. So they're kind of long, but if there is something, if you have any thoughts or feedback about the videos themselves, I would appreciate that as well. So yeah.
I think they're pretty solid. I mean, they kind of add up to about the time that you like normally have for a lecture, so it makes sense. You know, I don't think I think they're pretty digestible. I don't think that you need to like break it down into like 15-minute videos, because it is like, I mean, if you treat it like a lecture, you take notes. It's
I think the length is fine too, because I think 15 minutes would be too confusing, like going through it too fast. I think I would get lost a lot easier. I still like that you like still break everything down.
Yeah, and I think I'm repetitive. I repeat myself.
I'm cool with that.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you. If you ever do have any kind of feedback, or like, yo, the lighting is off, or, you know, what's up with your background over there, let me know too. Feel free to email me and let me know. But yeah, otherwise, so I don't know if folks had a chance to go through some of the lectures or the readings, if there were things that they wanted to kind of pick up from there first, or questions that emerged out of there.
Yeah, if you wanted to talk a little bit about, just for me personally, I was having trouble distinguishing. Neoliberalism is not just it's not just an economic agenda, right?
Not the way that I'm talking about it. It definitely is an economic agenda. It is it is an economic agenda, but it also includes, it is a way of thinking about society as well, right? Or it has at least assumptions built in about society that then the economic agenda is built on top of. So it's not just kind of like that has a social philosophy to it too. So that's partially when I was talking about the notion of, you know, that fundamentally that we are individuals and family. And so that's the realm of that there is within the neoliberal framework, that there isn't this thing that's the social as much. The social is the marketplace. That's where the social occurs. That it's the place of exchange. That there isn't a collective beyond that. That we're individuals and families, and then there's the marketplace, and sure, there's a limited government. So that is not an economic thing. That is a social philosophy type that is embedded in.
Yeah, I only asked because the way that the Harvey was talking about it, he was talking about like Reagan and Thatcher and like what they were pushing in their policies and stuff, and I always associate that with, you know, trickle down, supply side, whatever you want to call it. And that was before I looked at your lectures. I was just reading. I was like, it seems like a thought out economic policy, but the social I guess interpretation of it wasn't always there for me when I was doing the reading. I guess he's an economist, so that makes sense. I guess
He's a geographer.
not an economist.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. So if you want to kind of deal with those questions, and I could post these videos. There some of them are included in the extra credit assignment. Is by this one theorist. Her name is Wendy Brown, and she does a really great job of kind of dealing with or going through kind of what are the social aspect or the social or more kind of philosophical assumptions being made by neoliberalism. And he talks a little bit about this, David Harvey, when he talks about the Mont Pelerin Society, people like Ayn Rand, Frederick Hayek, and others. These folks were thinkers, intellectuals, philosophers. They weren't simply economists. And so they had a specific kind of worldview that then the economistic side of it grew out of. And for me particularly, quite frankly, like the social side of it is in a sense just as important, if not more important, than the economic side, because so the economics are like the way that we think about neoliberalism most of the time is stuff like privatization, deregulation, or generally speaking, the notion of an unfettered marketplace and a much more limited government, and more kind of emphasis on individualism, individual responsibility. That's normally in the culture how we kind of think about it. But the social assumptions of neoliberalism don't necessarily, for me at least, in my opinion, don't get interrogated as much. And so what you could do, what ends up happening is you have these debates and like people could agree, disagree on privatization, but the underlying assumption through which we're making the case for yes or no on privatization doesn't necessarily get discussed. And I think that's where the real that if you that's the foundation in a sense, so that today you could be pro privatization, tomorrow you could be against privatization for this industry or that industry, but the underlying assumption of, for example, society or people and how human beings interact with each other don't get questioned. And that at the end of the day, regardless of your specific policy standpoint on this or that policy, that's the thing that undergirds all of that. So now again, whether you believe in the neoliberal philosophy or you don't, that philosophy is important to deal with. That we shouldn't just look at the neoliberalism as simply a set of policies, but also as a kind of ideology. Right? And for me, I don't take ideology to be a pejorative, meaning that just because somebody says, oh, so-and-so is ideological, doesn't mean necessarily it's a bad thing. For me, it's like, okay, well, what's their ideology? That ideology could be a good thing too, right? So it's about interrogating and thinking through what the ideology is, what are its assumptions. You don't want to be demagogic, which means that regardless of facts that you encounter or evidence that you encounter, you remain stuck with whatever the idea that you have is. That is bad. But having an ideology isn't necessarily bad.
Dr. Barker, would you mind again going over the differences between the international and the transnational, or the national and the transnational?
Yeah. How did other folks kind of read that? How did you make sense of international versus transnational? Maybe you have way of speaking about it that might be different than mine. I'm curious.
I just I
I'm
just read
reading
it.
faces.
I just read it like it was more about like I guess not respecting, but it was more like things were like better kept in borders, and then nowadays obviously you've got technological innovations and other globalization in general that makes those borders a little bit more they're a little bit less relevant, I guess, for like your everyday business transactions for you, for maybe even like your personal things. Like if you wanted to fly tomorrow to the middle of Indonesia, you could, even though it's a couple borders away.
Yeah. So on the realm of just term like words, right? Inter means between, trans means across or through. So international means between nations, whereas transnational means through or crossing within, that it's not between. So that's on the level of just English, which then, in terms of what we're talking about, international economy uh, means an economy based on the relationships, economic relationships between countries, between nation states. And what nation states are or countries are is basically, here is a territory, here's a like a land, right, a geographic space that we've put a border around, and we've said that this bordered land is controlled by a given government. And so in the time of national accumulation regime, where we had international trade, what that meant was every state that has this border has an economy. The economy of every state is confined to and is composed of stuff that happens within that border, so that we could think about and talk about the American economy as being the economy, the economic activities writ large, of everything that's going on within all of the states in America, all of the territories that the government of the United States formally controls. We say, okay, that's the American economy. And then what the American economy, and the same thing for the British, the French, the Iranians, the Egyptians, what have you. Each government had this border that it controlled, and then within that border, there were economic activities. So we would say this is the Egyptian economy is composed of the economic activities within Egypt, the state, the bordered place. And then we would talk about the American economy or the Egyptian economy as having this power globally because its economy would have a relationship with the other economy. And that relationship was basically the stuff I used to sell to those people and the stuff I used to buy from those people, right? And so that was the international business or international trade. Key within that operation, or the assumption was that we had the way things were produced. So in the realm of production, stuff was made inside the border of that place, right? So we would talk about made in America, meaning it was made in America. It was made within the borders of America. And then you could, that the type of, you would have these types of debate, like, who has a better car manufacturing? Like, is it, American made cars are X, Y, and Z. Japanese cars are X, Y, and Z. Because you would talk about kind of the type of economy that the United States have, and you could always rely on it to make this type of machinery because the productive capacity of this country was, had these qualities. That's the international realm, international trade, or what I was, and which was part of what I was calling a national accumulation regime. what I'm arguing is that starting in the 1970s, you have this shift to this thing called the much more transnational economy. In this case, a transnational economy is built around, or the thing that changes is that production now becomes no longer stuff made in a single economy. So like if now the car is not made in the United States, literally every part of that machinery is made up of, is made in different places. So that the assembly line that produces the final product, being this car, that assembly line no longer exists within the borders of a given government, but rather exists within a bunch of governments across a bunch of different bordered places.
Outsourcing.
Outsourcing is one mechanism of this change in production. Absolutely. One amongst many, but outsourcing is a main concept, right? So, but then what that means, the implication is that production now is global. And when you and then not only then is production global, the finance is also global. So that the same we could talk about outsourcing in the productive capacity, in the industrial capacity, but money is also able to move first because you need to send money to the person who you outsource stuff to, but then also like you are able to move that money around. Like when you make money, where do you put it? Well, I don't have to put it in an American bank. I could put it somewhere else too. In addition, the buying and selling of financial mechanisms like stocks, dividends, insurance, securities, and different kind of securitized products. And I could talk about, if people want to talk through securitization, those products, you could buy them also from a global set of places. So that the very kind of structure of how economic activity used to occur now no longer is there. It's different, it's global. The economy has changed maps. Politically, when you think about like who governs what land, in a sense, our political imagination is still confined to the borders, right? You're American, I'm Mexican, that person is Salvadorian, or what have you. Like our political way in which we identify is still captured geographic within those borders. The economic side of things no longer abides by those borders, right? So like a company could be owned by people all across the world. Its management could be from people all across the world. Its workers are from all across the world anyway because of outsourcing, and its consumers also could be all around the world. So that in that sense, that the nature, the economic activity has transcended the borders, the political borders of the nation state, which they hadn't before. And sorry, Kevin, I know you want to say something. Let me just make as an implication of that. Before, we could talk about the American economy versus the British economy versus the Japanese, right? And so you could compete, and they would. When the Americans and the British would get together, or with the Japanese, it would be the political leaders would each be trying to defend and advocate for their own capitalists, for their own industrial kind of heavyweights, because the American government would say, I'm advocating for what like Ford and GM wants. And the assumption being for these politicians, like, well, if Ford and GM do better, so does America, right? Now, that's no longer the case because GM and Ford are not American. So that when the United States and the British get together, they're talking about what is to the interest of global activity. Because it's very hard, in fact, it might be farcical to think of what is American versus British, right? So like when COVID-19 hit, Wuhan province, and China started to slow down and like shelter in place and do all of the things that it did, the economic repercussions were felt in Korea and then in the United States and in Britain. 70 years ago, if the same thing would have happened, well, we would have seen it. Everybody would be looking at China being like, look, their economy is totally collapsing. We're winning, like we're doing better economically than those guys. Now, if something happens to China, it's like, holy crap, it's going to take 2 weeks, but we're going to start paying for that in all kinds of ways, because the Chinese economy is like, it's integrated within the American economy. It's hard to kind of be like, oh, this is the Chinese part and this is the American part. You were going to say something, Kevin, like 17 minutes ago before
You're good. I was going to comment that it's kind of scary for a person who lives in that modern day world, because you have all your rights, or most of your rights are, like Harvey was saying in the book, they're politically based, right? Because the neoliberal ideology is that most, if not all, your rights that are human rights, natural rights, whatever rights that you shouldn't have to really pay anything for, are political.
Mm-hmm.
But your political rights only extend to your ability to influence your country. When in reality, if you've got economic rights, then maybe you can influence somewhere else. But if you've got no promised economic rights that like neoliberalism is advocating for, and that a lot of us, like we don't have a right to a job or an education, really, or something like that. That's scary, because you there's things happening, like you said, all across the world that can affect you, but you yourselves have no promised economic rights.
Absolutely. And this is why in the video that I recorded, I was talking about, this was the response in at least the economic elites in the core countries, was like, how let's move beyond the confines of the nation state and break the class compromise, because the class compromise had put certain limitations on them, let's say wages, so that if I could get around this through outsourcing or other ways, then I could be able to generate wealth that I wouldn't be able to under the nationally contained economies, which means that they've changed the game. They're playing chess, and unions and activists and or advocates or what have you are still playing checkers. We still operate based off of, okay, I'm going to put pressure on the American government, right? But it's like, well, yeah, but the American government has its own now limitations in terms of how much control it has over the economy, because of other kinds of because of the globality of the economy itself. So I'll be talking about this in next week's video, because in next week's video, I'll try to kind of push to our thinking in terms of, well, what is the ramification? So I defined neoliberalism for you all this week, or I attempted to. Next week, I'll try to say a little bit about what the consequences of that neoliberalism is for how it redefines governments, and the relationship of governments to like corporations and the social. The week thereafter, so in 2 weeks, then I'll do a case study of talking about Greece in 2015. And so I think at that point, Kevin, I will come back to this point that you were making about what this means for democratic potentiality, or the relationship of democratic impulses on the one hand, and the political versus kind of the economic realities. And so it's 2015 in Greece, which at the time was a really cataclysmic event. Now we're under COVID, so it might not seem as urgent, but I would say that the same kind of structures at play, and it'll make sense when I send it to you. The structures at play that responded to the Greek the Greek financial crisis are still at play currently, and so it could be very informative in the sense of like what happened in Greece to what could potentially happen.
actually have like a pretty, I don't know, I think it's like a good example maybe of the whole, I guess the effects of globalization and stuff like that. Do you know what the UFC is, Dr. Parker?
Yeah, like
Uh,
people would beat each other up. Sense.
yeah. Um, they're having like difficulties of because it's an international fighting thing. They have fighters that are from Russia, from all over, from Asia, from the United States. But if they're going to have a fight and have a competition, a lot of those guys can't come over to the United States because they were just not allowing them, international flights and such. And so the owner of the UFC solution was to, I think he's either buying or he's expropriating an island somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, like a private island. No, very real. And they're going to be hosting fights there, and he's going to be flying international fighters uh, in there for fights with like other American fighters in there because they can't bring them to fight in the United
Sorry, and
States.
sorry,
They're
just
going,
to clarify. So then, this is because of the global pandemic that this is his. Okay, wow.
that's his solution is if we can't have the fights here, for border purposes, the United States, its government only has so much power over their border, but they can say, oh, no international fighters, anybody over here. So the solution is to take the venue and put it somewhere that is not, per se, under control by any given government.
Hmm. So previous to this, the government started to do this, which what they started to do is they either did it at a much more general level or at a much more kind of local level. At a local level, what they call this is free trade zones or export zones, which is these areas that the UFC guy is buying an island that is not controlled politically by any state, or it's controlled by a very weak state that's giving him free authority over it. Governments do this too, where they say, okay, here is however many acres I'll set aside, and in this area, all of my rules that I have put in place for the rest of the country don't apply here. So like, okay, minimum wage is $15 over there. In this, 100 acres, that doesn't apply. And so and this was done across the world. This is a very common thing, free trade zones, right? And so then companies are able to come to that country and set up shop, but without having to then deal with the regulations that they would otherwise have to do. And it's a way in which governments are ceding their power. They are forgrowing their control over certain territory over to kind of the marketplace, and a way in which they could tell their populations that, oh yeah, I do care about your wages. Look, it's 15 hours generally, even though over here it's not, right? So this was an exercise that governments did on local levels, but it's also occurred at a much more generalized level. So in the United States, for example, entire states started to do this. So then states started to say, this was part of the notion of deregulation. Let's get rid of certain regulations and so thus you're creating, basically making the entire state a free trade zone. So whereas like Joe Biden, he's from Delaware. Delaware's one of its main economic activities is finance, because the state, and it's not the only one, have created laws to allow so that you could get closer and closer to being like a Cayman Islands, for example, of being able to put money that has all kinds of loopholes within it, within a place like Delaware. So then the state's economy looks like it's doing things, but really what you've done is the state has relinquished control over a certain part of the economy to, in this case, finance, and did what basically the UFC guy is trying to do, which is go to a place that doesn't have laws, so that it could do the things that the laws would not allow it to do. Right? So I think it's a good example.
Why is something like that allowed though? Like, I don't get it.
So the argument that's made is that you're able to generate wealth. So I'll say, like, I'll say a little bit, like, on in the financial world, we have, so a couple of things. So like when we talk about capitalism or the economy, you could break it down. There are different parts of the economy. And at different moments in time, different parts of the economy, meaning the people in charge of different types of economic activity, become more dominant or leaders of that economy as opposed to others. So just like when we talked in class about there's peasants and there's industrial workers, they're both like similar in the sense that, you know, they probably don't have as much money, they work or blah, 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 but there's the difference between them. If most of your population are involved in agricultural work, that means you're rural, that means there's a type of work that you do, that means that you're a little bit different in terms of your thinking or operation than, let's say, an industrial worker who's working in these very tight, compact factories. The same thing on the other side for capitalists. So between the 19th to the 20th century, if you go back earlier on, in the United States, the sector of the economy that was the dominant sector was industry, the people who built stuff. And then after that were people like, and then the other was like extractive sector, like mining, for example. Those guys were like, you know, the people in charge. There's bankers, there was other folks, but they were not the dominant sector of the economy. So if we now fast forward a whole bunch and come to today, if you want, we could break it down. Like, I mean, if you think about it, there is the industry still. There's still extractive, like mining, even though mining is now become very low in terms of its power in the overall economy. Then you have like the tech sector, all the digital world, so the Microsofts, Amazons, Google, all of that. Finance, and then like you also have real estate. These are the different sectors. The people, and so you could think about, well, who are the leading sectors in the economy? And we, you know, the leading sector right now is finance by far. So even if you take like a car manufacturing firm, car manufacturers, they make more money by selling you loans to buy their cars than they do selling you the car. So that the financial, you know, like I bought a Honda. I also got my loan. Yeah, I also bought my loan to buy the Honda from Honda. I didn't get my loan from Chase or Bank of America. So that Honda sold me the car and sold me the loan to buy its car. They're going to make more money off of the loan than they are going to make off of the car itself. That their financial side is bigger than their industrial side, bigger in terms of how much money it makes. So finance is the leading sector of the economy, followed by some of the others. Industry is no longer the leader. That has ramifications. If you look at the Trump administration, the Secretary of Treasury right now, Steve Mnuchin. Steve Mnuchin, where does he come from? He comes from the financial side of things. And so he's part of financial capital. And then who are some of the other kind of big people in the administration? Somebody like Jared Kushner, who is from real estate. So is Trump himself. That is, Obama wasn't that different. The Obama administration wasn't real estate so much, but it was all finance. All of his top kind of big economic people in the room were finance people, which has ramifications, because on the financial side, and something like finance and real estate, the money that you generate or the profits that you make don't necessarily does not mean that you have to engage with workers. That the profit making does not require labor. Industry requires labor. So if you have the CEO of Boeing or this as part of in this closed room where they're thinking through and brainstorming solutions, it means something to have an industrialist versus a banker in there. They think a little bit differently. So that's on the one hand. So then we have finance. Now, what is finance doing? What we have done now. So before, banks used to give you loans. They used to give people who made stuff capitalist loans, the industrialist loans, and that was very important because you take a loan initially to invest in the wages and the overhead costs, and then you make that money back plus some. And so then you would be able to give that loan back. So the loans that the bankers would give kind of greased up this process of production. What ends up happening then is that the bankers said, well, I could sell what the banker is doing is he is taking on the risk of giving you a loan, and he is risking your ability to pay back that loan to him, right? So it's like, well, I don't know, maybe Georgina's gonna pay, maybe not. That's why I'm gonna check her background. Is she what has she done in her previous loans and blah, 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 blah. And so he is taking on the risk. So then what ends up happening a little as the regulations on banking start to erode, the banker says, well, here, I'm gonna give Georgina the loan. And then instead of me holding on to that risk, I'm gonna turn around and sell that loan to Nate. And I'm gonna go to Nate and be like, yo, Nate, I got this loan from Georgina. She's really good. She's gonna pay it back. I don't wanna deal with the problems of the risk involved. I'm gonna sell it to you. And then Nate's like, okay, yeah, I'll buy that loan from you. And so then he buys that loan. And then I'm gonna turn around to Kevin and then be like, yo, Kevin, you want to buy insurance on Georgina's ability to pay the loan or not? And so, you know, I'll sell you this insurance. And then Kevin is like, yeah, okay, I'll buy that insurance. And then Nate goes, and Nate right now has a bunch of these loans that he's buying, Georgina's and Vanessa's and Hannah's and what have you. And then he puts all of these loans together, and he turns around to Kevin, who's also bought the insurance in the case that you don't pay it off, and he sells all these clumped up loans to Kevin. And then Kevin decides to buy. Kevin right now he's just spending money left and right. So then he buys it up. And so what ends up happening in this process is that only one person got the loan, Georgina. And only Georgina got the loan to actually do something in the real world. She either bought a house or invested in her business. So she's actually doing something physically on the ground. These other guys, all these other people, are speculating about what happens in the ground. But that speculation has generated a bunch of different products. They've sold the loan, they've sold an insurance on the loan, then they clumped up these loans and created a different product, and they sold that. And so they've produced, this is called abstraction, because Georgina's economic activity is not abstract. She's buying a house. But what Nate did, selling that stuff to somebody else and then selling it to whatever, that's an abstraction. So then you get multiple levels of abstraction, right? I'll give you another example that I think is even more bizarre, which is something called the futures market. The futures market, this happens in commodity prices as well. So let's say let's go back to Georgina. Georgina is the non-abstract person here. She actually lives in the real world. Georgina is a rice farmer in India. And Georgina says that, look, I'm gonna sell, or somebody comes to Georgina, Nate again, Nate says, I wanna buy Georgina's rice crops from 5 years from now. not her rice crop that she's making today, but the rice that she's going to make 5 years from now. And Georgina's like, all right, cool, here. Well, I'm gonna sell you the 100 kilograms of rice that I'm gonna make 5 years from now. So now Nate has a piece of paper that says, I own the rice from 5 years from now. And tomorrow, let's say the monsoon season is really bad in India, and the crops go bad, or a lot of the crops go bad of this year's crops. All of a sudden, Kevin goes to Nate and he's like, look, man, this rice from 5 years from now is going to lose in price. I'll buy it off of you. And Nate's like, yeah, man, I'm losing money on this. Here you go. And then he sells it to Kevin. Now Kevin owns rice from 5 years from now, but he bought it for cheaper than Nate. And then, you know, another bank could create an insurance on that, sell that. Other things that could happen on rice, and so then these guys are going to be trading in this paper of rice for 5 years from now, with the rice not even existing. And they're speculating on the price of rice for 5 years from now. In the process, they themselves make and lose money on that speculation. The repercussions being that the price of actual rice of today goes up and down based off of the speculative activity of these two people over here that are making money off of the futures market. So then Georgina was asking initially, well, why do they do that? The answer that they give is that by me doing this futures market transaction, or even the ones about loans, we have generated wealth that didn't exist before. That Nate, in buying your rice from 5 years from now, gave you money. He gave you money that you didn't have. And then you were able to take that money and invest it in whatever you wanted today. And then he sold it to Kevin, made some cash off of that. Kevin did this other thing, and so all of a sudden, once we've moved from this actual economic activity on the ground to this abstract activity, that abstract activity has generated money. And so we have produced and entered into the marketplace cash that you wouldn't otherwise have had. They say that is the reason why that is a good thing. And so they say, look, the amount of money that is available is on a much higher level than before because we've generated all of this wealth.
Okay, I have a question though. So Kevin and Nathan are like companies or countries, economists, anybody? What are they? Like, what are they?
Rich people.
Who are those people? Okay. Great.
So these are global investors. So they could be actual just people. They could be hedge funds. Hedge funds are basically a collection of, here's literally 10 billionaires who each person put like a couple of billion, and here's this hedge fund. And this hedge fund then is basically like, creates a team of bankers and investors, and they use the money that they got from the billionaires to make money and to pay these guys, to give these guys make money for them. So it could be, but hedge funds, for me, hedge funds are like people, like individuals, or it could be a company, right? It could be Goldman Sachs, an investment firm. So then it's a company. And it could also be like sovereign funds, which are governments. So like the sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. I mean, these guys are a bit funny, but like in the sense of like, how much of that money is the country's money and how much of it is just the ruling family's money. So then there's those kinds of people. And then there's people like pension funds. So like my pensions is owned by CalPERS. CalPERS invests on my behalf. Which then, but the people that CalPERS operates through an investment firm. And so it's the investment firm that's doing these things. It's not like I'm sitting there moving my money from this fund to that fund. That I individually don't have that much power Yeah. So those are kind of the peoples that are doing this.
And like all like overall that like helps the global economy? And like
This is what they say.
okay.
Or in other words, they say that we are generating capital at a global level that that didn't exist before. Now, other people will say that you're operating like a casino. So a casino generates a lot of wealth, but no work gets done in a casino. Right? When you go into a casino, you spend money and your money makes money. You don't work to make money. So that it's just that the dollar is making money on the dollar based off of speculation, right? I play the roulettes when I go to a casino because I don't know, it's easier, and I am basically speculating that the next time this ball goes around, it's gonna hit. I only bet black or red or columns, so I'm speculating about where this ball is gonna drop. And that's how I make money. Are you all there? Okay, I thought I lost you for a second. So, because I've been having internet issues all day, so.
No, sorry, my mom gave me a French fry. Sorry.
Sometimes those are more important activities. So they say that it's generating money. The critique is that you on the one hand you're not the wealth that you're generating is not generating productive capacity, right? So if you were in an arena where you had industrial activity and then your economy expands, that means you're making more stuff. So you can't make more stuff without having more workers, without having like those stuff then has to be sold. It just means something different than I'm generating cash on cash on cash. Production isn't, nothing is happening at the level of production. So this is where you have what is called like jobless recoveries. The economy is expanding, but no new jobs are being created. Or the economy is expanding, but people's wages isn't increasing. Because the money is increasing at the level of finance, for example, without having a repercussion on this area.
Does that go back to how like at one point you said like your money is like worth less than like 10, 15 years ago? Like is that why like the economy is getting better but I'm not getting paid more?
So this was in the lecture you're talking about, right? Is that right, Georgina?
I think
I fell. Sorry.
you like towards the beginning of the class, Professor.
Yeah, this is
we're
like a
talking
while
about
ago.
like how much your money could actually buy, or like the ability of your money to buy things was the same as it was in the 1970s, like 40, 50 years ago.
Oh, so what I was saying is that the wages that you're getting is less than what the wages that existed earlier on in the 1970s. So there is, so that and I mentioned it at the end of the lecture this week, that the level of productivity of the American worker has steadily grown, has increased, but the wages since the 1970s has stagnated or decreased. So you're making less money, but you're being more productive. And what has covered up for that, the fact that like you're making less money, but your standard of living hasn't decreased, that you're still able to buy the refrigerator, the TV, the car, the things that would make you have a good standard of living, maybe. That hasn't, like, your purchasing power is still there. So you don't feel like you're making less money, but in fact you are. The difference is covered up by credit, right? You don't have the money, but you use your credit card. So that the level of indebtedness of the American worker has gone up. So the Americans today are the most indebted society in the world, if not the history of the world. And that makes you feel better, so that you don't go and burn banks down, because you feel like you could I could go buy a TV today. Here is a credit card. It'll take me like 10 years to pay it off or whatever. But it doesn't matter. I could buy a house. I bought a house. So I feel like I am a homeowner, but in reality, I don't own nothing. I'm in debt.
Off of a 30-year mortgage. Right?
30-year mortgage. It's going to take me 30 years, maybe if I don't lose my job, to actually own my house at that point. So, which by the way, so 1970s, right? This is also the start of the takeover of the financial side becoming more dominant than the industrial side. And it was loosening up these regulations, lowering wages, loosening up the regulations on credit and the takeover of credit over these things. And so like that credit that you have, the thing that provides you, that gives you all kinds of anxieties and stresses, if you don't already have it, you will very shortly as you graduate. That thing generates wealth for those who then buy and sell in your loans and credit. So there's somebody that is speculating based off of your stress and anxiety, and they're able to generate then wealth off of that. So it's genius and extremely lucrative. It's also why it's called it's probably the most parasitic side of the economy, real estate and finance, because
someone is getting. Go ahead.
No, finish. Go ahead.
If someone's getting rich off of my pain and anxiety, they must be pretty rich.
Because you have a lot of it.
Right now, yeah, we would say so.
So then look, then what happens is that then you're at a generalized level, if the population becomes from a level of governance, the population becomes much more disciplined and a lot less rambunctious, because the government doesn't have to do anything. The government doesn't have to use police or the military. There's just credit agencies. Like, you don't have time to kind of hang out and see what happens. You need to pay off your loans. And if you don't pay off your loans every single day, your credit goes bad. And if your credit goes bad, then you won't be able to rent a home. You will not be able to do a lot of things. And that process of you getting a credit, you paying a credit, and if not paying a credit, having a credit agency devalue your credit so that nobody gives you money, all of that is controlled by the financial industry, right? It's not the government that tells you what your credit is. It's a private corporation that says what your credit is. And if anything goes wrong, the government doesn't intervene on your behalf. You go figure it out. So that is an arena of the economy that has expanded dramatically starting in the 1970s and with the onset of neoliberalism. It didn't happen like this. So previously, under the other era, people used to talk about the American dream of ownership and blah, 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 blah. That, in a certain extent, for the privileged sector of the working class, that used to occur. You used to be able to own your home. And so then the parents would be able to turn over a set of assets to their kids. If I turn over my house to my kid, she just owes a lot of money. She doesn't actually own the house, right? So now the economy has changed and there's new types of realities.
So like all the credit, it's just speculation on your future labor. And once you complete that future labor, you're just expropriating the meager wages that you're getting, right? And then surplus value is already going to like your boss or whoever. So it's like expropriation on the front end with your labor, the extraction of labor, and on the back end with the credit
card. Future labor, yeah.
Yeah.
So then as a student, you're already indebted before you've even worked. So we tell you, go major in this thing so you can get a job. but the process of you majoring in a thing so you could get a job already means that you cannot but get that job, and you have to work so you could pay off the education that's meant to get you that job. So you've already kind of, they've already slotted you in, and you're already being disciplined by the conditions of the marketplace, right? This is, for me, this is one of the reasons why, for example, the American public is also such a, what is it called? Passive society. It's a much more obedient one, because they can't. Like, so in China, you could say, okay, you have an authoritarian regime. If you rebel, the state will come and put you in prison. Or at least that's the story told by China, okay? In the United States, to a certain extent that exists. Like, if you get to a certain point, the police will come after you. But even before you get there, you have to be, you cannot, like, you know what, I'm not gonna go to work from 9 to 5, I'm gonna go organize. And then how are you gonna pay? How are you gonna pay your student loans? What are you gonna, you're gonna risk your livelihood and the livelihood of your family for what now? Right? So that the incentive structure is built in a certain way that there is no room for you to think beyond your operation in the marketplace. You have to.
That's crazy.
It's genius.
Mm-hmm.
In a really, like, woo way.
And I wish I had thought of that kind of way.
You're genius on that way. To bank on people's stresses and anxieties. Look, folks,
I mean,
there's a
true,
reason why
though.
mental health is such an issue. Is not because, like, you people meaning like the younger generation is just like not mentally tough enough to, you know, deal with things. It's because stress and anxiety over everyday livelihood has become so much more dramatic. The stakes are a lot higher. If I can't pay my mortgage, this is why people are risking their lives to go and work, right? Like, why people are going and are, you know, are part of Instacart, right? So that I could pay and shop at Costco without having to go to Costco, because there's somebody else who cannot but work, has to put his or her kind of health in risk that, because if they don't do that, they can't survive the next day. Sorry, now I should figure out a happy ending to the class somehow. I feel like we've gone down a very dark side.
You just reminded me of all the money I owe. It's a great time.
I know, me too.
I'm gonna cry.
But, you know, if you're into following the news, then I don't know if that's a healthy thing to do these days. I'm trying to limit myself to, like, I'm a news junkie. I used to, like, go to sleep with the news playing before. Now I don't do that anymore. I'm trying to limit myself to like an hour worth of news, not more than that. But if you are listening to the news, especially kind of the responses and the economics of it, think about, like, when these people talking about the economy, like, think about who they actually are, right? Like, what type of business were they in? Because the type of business that they were in, it informs like how they think about things. So it's not just random, right? So if multiple administrations, one after another, puts a banker in charge of the Treasury Department, what does that mean in terms of the economic assumptions that are being made in terms of policy making? And then that enables you to move beyond the discourse in this country, which is quite simplistic, that politics and economy is broken down based on Democrat versus Republican. That's not how the actual world operates, Democrat versus Republican, right? Especially in the economic realm, it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. The policies of the Obama administration was not that dissimilar from the Bush administration and then previously. And you could see that in terms of who's in charge and the type of operations they're doing. In other words, it helps us to think structurally at that point rather than instrumentally, like as in like, oh, well, you know, Obama was a nice guy, he talked well, so I really kind of like him, versus like, you know, Trump is doesn't talk that well, he's not sophisticated, I don't like him. That is kind of making the differences into these personal things, and that is all PR. That's the way that you see it, but it's not how actually it works. You want to think about in the rooms when these ideas are being talked about, who's there, right? And then what, before these guys enter into the room to make the statements that they make, they're engaging and dealing with, they have their whole lives behind them. So who are they hanging out with? Who's their business partners? How do they make money? What type of philosophies and ideas they have? That informs then who these people are. And so this is the process that we ought to think about, because this is more structural. And it gets us beyond kind of this false dichotomy between Republican and Democrat, to kind of see how, like, how society is being structured, right? Because like the Democratic, when you say the Democrats want to do this, you ought to ask yourself, who are the Democrats? Who controls the Democratic Party, right? Because different groups of people have controlled the Democratic Party. So in the case of finance, really starting in the 1980s, the financial markets, the Democratic Party has gone along just as well with financial capital as the Republican Party has. So then what does that mean in terms of the politics of the United States? In other words, within the Democratic Party landscape, labor unions started to lose dramatic amounts of power, starting in the 1970s, and especially with the rise of the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration and the Clintons took over the Democratic Party, and one of the biggest losers in that process was labor. And so, you know, and again, I don't really care about trying to convince you to vote here or there, but like thinking, how do we analyze the situation? And I want you to be able to analyze these things in a more profound way than say, well, I've always voted Democrat, so whatever the Democrats say, I'm with those people, or I've always voted, you know, on this.
Great, Bernie. Did you guys hear about that? Bernie Sanders dropped out of the...
I know, he did drop out. I thought you were saying vote for him, and I was like, he dropped out though.
No,
I was like, wait, he doesn't know.
Rip Bernie.
Oh, I thought you said vote, and I was like, wait, no.
Yeah, and like, so, you know, so we're out of time, but if you go beyond a little bit, the fight within the primaries, like who makes up the campaigns? So some labor unions sided with Bernie, like UTLA, for example, the teachers union in Los Angeles. The teachers union in Los Angeles has broken ranks with some of the more traditional labor unions over kind of how the Democratic Party should operate. So like, who are the unions that support Biden, let's say, versus Sanders? Who are the funders and donors? That then enables you to see beyond the facade that the DNC puts out, to see like, okay, who has actual power in the Democratic Party? Who's setting policy? And what is that going to mean? And then how close are they? Like, and then who's doing that in the Republican Party, right? And what are the policies being set there, to then be able to engage kind of the actual differences that are going to come about or not. A lot of times we in the public get sold on, like, we look at social issues and the so-called culture wars as the main difference, and as a way of the parties differentiating themselves between each other. But in many other ways, you could start to see continuities between them. So look at foreign policy, look at economic policies, and you see this other much more complex kind of structure operating than like pro-abortion, anti-abortion, pro this, anti-that. It becomes more fluid and more interesting, is a bad way of putting it. So we're out of time. Sorry I talked a lot, but I'll be posting up another video for you all, and then we could kind of pick up this conversation next week as well. So, you know, please, when you're looking at it, just jot down any kinds of thoughts that you have. If you put up questions or comments for me in that other discussion board, I'll make sure to respond to those before our Wednesday meeting, or we could start with them on Wednesday. Okay? And I have office hours also, if anybody wants to check me out. These are, I was telling my other class, this is by far the most exciting time of my week, because I get to talk to non-4-year-olds and people that are not my wife. So this is very good.
True that.
I'll see you all.
My twin brother is driving me crazy.
All right. Bye, you all. I'll see you all next week.
Bye-bye.